But I find it fascinating that the Trump administration is expending all of this energy over this issue. They tried to indict the lawmakers and failed, which is, I mean, it's like a needle in a haystack. It's so rare. And now this, should they just drop this issue?
I don't think that this is a wise use of political capital. But I do have to say, in your introduction, you talked about criminalizing rhetoric. And I think a lot of Republicans feel triggered because that was essentially the case that Jack Smith had against Trump, was going after him because Trump said that it wasn't a fair election. So I do think that Republicans are very sensitive about this. But look, I think we should end. I think we should end the lawfare. I think Tom Tillis is right. Certainly Democrats started it under Biden. They put Navarro in jail. But I would like to see the Trump administration.
Okay, so
you can't compare
the two. Jack Smith's
No.
case was about the simple fact.
In today's video, Abby Phillip and Bakari Sellers shut down Lydia Moynihan on Newsnight with Abby Phillip. What makes this conversation bigger than just one case is the pattern. When political figures start testing the limits of punishment, whether it's reducing someone's rank, threatening prosecutions, or promising investigations, that's when the rule of law gets blurry. Meanwhile, the counter-argument tries to frame it as just another example of lawfare. But there's a difference between accountability backed by evidence and using authority to settle scores. And that distinction matters, especially in an election year. So let's dive in and watch how Abby Phillip and Bakari Sellers destroys Lydia Moynihan on Newsnight with Abby Phillip.
The Trump administration's attempt to criminalize rhetoric just failed after a federal judge told Pete Hegseth that he can't punish Senator Mark Kelly over a video urging U.S. troops to defy illegal orders. Hegseth had sought to reduce Kelly's military rank and dock his retirement pay, but the judge called Hegseth's actions obviously unlawful retaliation and wrote in his ruling, quote, "As Bob Dylan famously said, you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." Hegseth is now vowing to appeal that ruling, but Republican Senator Tom Tillis is warning him what goes around comes around. He says this will come back to haunt the defense secretary once this White House is out of office. And Judge, is this the right decision from that judge who made this?
Absolutely the right decision. And let's remember, too, that this is a Bush appointee. And so I am really pleased to see the independence of the judiciary. This is absolutely the right decision in this case. Now, they vowed to appeal, and so this is not going to be over, and we're going to see this over and over and over again. But the senator had, and the other people, the 5 people, 6 people in all, had the right to say exactly what they said on that video. And what they were saying is that you do not have to obey illegal orders. And there is nothing wrong with having said that. It is not a problem. And the judge did exactly the right thing in that case. And I'm very pleased to see that.
I think it's probably, look, I think it's fair to have a view that they shouldn't have done it. It was imprudent. It was unnecessary. All that is fine. But I find it fascinating that the Trump administration is expending all of this energy over this issue. They tried to indict the lawmakers and failed, which is, I mean, it's like a needle in a haystack. It's so rare. And now this, should they just drop this issue?
I don't think that this is a wise use of political capital. But I do have to say, in your introduction, you talked about criminalizing rhetoric. And I think a lot of Republicans feel triggered because that was essentially the case that Jack Smith had against Trump, was going after him because Trump said that it wasn't a fair election. So I do think that Republicans are very sensitive about this, but look.
What makes the retaliation angle troubling is the constitutional layer on top of it. The First Amendment protects political speech at the highest level. Courts have repeatedly ruled that the government cannot retaliate against individuals for protected speech. In fact, retaliation claims are one of the most well-established civil rights doctrines in federal law. When a judge calls something obviously unlawful retaliation, that's not flowery language. That's a serious constitutional red flag. And let's talk about the bigger pattern here. Historically, attempts to punish lawmakers for speech have almost always backfired. The Supreme Court has consistently upheld strong protections for public officials speaking on matters of public concern. Even controversial speech gets protection, especially controversial speech. If administrations start testing the boundaries by going after retirement pay or rank reductions over political disagreements, that sets a dangerous precedent for whoever holds power next. That's where Senator Thom Tillis's warning actually becomes relevant. Political power changes hands. If one administration normalizes punitive action against critics, the next one can do the exact same thing. That's not stability, that's escalation. Also worth noting, the judge in this case wasn't some liberal firebrand. A Bush appointee ruling against a Republican administration reinforces that this wasn't partisan, it was legal. Federal judges, especially those appointed for life, are insulated from political pressure precisely so they can make these calls without worrying about party loyalty. And here's the practical side. Using this much political capital to pursue something that courts are likely to strike down again on appeal doesn't project strength, it projects overreach. Voters, including independents and military families, tend to be wary of anything that looks like politicizing the armed forces. At the end of the day, Judge Hatchett's position aligns with long-standing constitutional doctrine, military law, and basic separation of powers. You can disagree with someone's tone. You can say something was imprudent. But once you cross into punishment for protected speech, you're no longer debating policy, you're testing the limits of the Constitution.
I think we should end the lawfare. I think Thom Tillis is right. Certainly Democrats started it under Biden. They put Navarro in jail. But I would like to see the Trump administration.
Okay, so
you can't compare
Jack Smith's case was about the simple fact that not only that, but you had phone calls in places like Georgia where he would try to influence people, pressure people, and he'd say, go find me 11,000 votes or whatever it is. Jack Smith's case was about the fact he had classified documents in his bathroom. So Jack Smith's case was a little bit more robust. It falls out of this. What would be more in line is if
a lot more robust.
What would be more in line with this is if Secretary Lloyd Austin, for example, tried to indict Tom Cotton. That is more analogous to what we're talking about and the absurdity of it. Because what I like to do with my Republican friends is I like to say, well, what if Barack Obama, right? And people are just outraged. Like, what if somebody else tries to do the things and to be a party that are such free speech absolutionists, to go out of your way. I mean, we've heard that all the time, the words lawfare and free speech and the First Amendment, but then to try to prosecute that continuously. Donald Trump is not necessarily it's not analogous to what we're talking about in any way, shape, form, or fashion, but this in itself, I think, should offend their common notions of what it means to be a Republican, but I guess what's good for the goose is not good for the gander.
Well, we should remind the audience that Pete Hegseth himself said this exact same thing in 2016. The video is up on CNN's website and YouTube.
Play it. Well,
let's take a listen to remind the audience. I love it.
I do think there have to be consequences for abject war crimes. If you're doing something that is just completely unlawful and ruthless, then there is a consequence for that. That's why the military said it won't follow unlawful orders from their commander-in-chief. There's a standard, there's an ethos, there's a belief that we are above what so many things that our enemies or others would do.
That may very well be why Thom Tillis is warning that this could come back and bite him.
Now, the cases brought by Jack Smith weren't about someone voicing an opinion that an election was unfair. They involved documented actions. There's a recorded phone call in Georgia where Donald Trump asked officials to find 11,780 votes. That's not rhetoric floating in the air. That's a direct request to state officials during a certified election process. There were also charges tied to the handling of classified documents, including materials stored in unsecured areas. Federal law, specifically the Espionage Act and obstruction statutes, governs that kind of conduct. Whether someone agrees with the prosecution or not, the legal foundation is far more concrete than just he said something. That's what makes the analogy Lydia tries to draw fall apart. prosecuting alleged interference with election certification or mishandling classified material is not the same as retaliating against someone over protected speech. One involves statutory violations with evidentiary records. The other involves the First Amendment and long-standing protections against government retaliation. And the free speech angle is where the inconsistency really stands out. Conservatives have for years positioned themselves as the loudest defenders of the First Amendment, especially when it comes to political speech. But the Supreme Court has consistently ruled that political speech is at the highest level of constitutional protection. In cases like New York Times v. Sullivan and Brandenburg v. Ohio, the court reinforced that even controversial or inflammatory speech gets broad protection unless it crosses into direct incitement or unlawful conduct. That's a high bar, intentionally so. Also worth remembering, the military itself operates under the principle that service members must refuse unlawful orders. That's not partisan. That's baked into the Uniform Code of Military Justice and reinforced after World War II to prevent abuses of authority. So reminding troops of that standard aligns with military ethics, not rebellion.
Because, I mean, if you can indict Mark Kelly or try to demote him over his comments, why wouldn't you demote or indict Pete Hegseth?
Look, let me just say this about Tom Tillis. I don't think he's wrong, but the counterpoint is that does anyone think that the Democratic Party is not going to seek prosecutions against Trump officials after they're out of office?
I hope
That's
they do.
this is my point. So my point to Bakari is like he is justifying exactly what Tom Tillis is saying, that the Democratic Party, just like they did last time, just like Tish James did when she ran for office saying, I'm going to get Donald Trump, I'm going to use the power of my office to get Donald Trump. We are going to see, no matter what, a number of Democratic prosecutions against Trump officials. Now, Judge, you said before you were very happy with the judicial system, how the judge, weighed the right way. This was a Bush appointee. Do you also agree that a non-Trump appointee in Georgia just gave the federal government the ability to seize 700 boxes of the votes?
It was a magistrate.
Yeah, it was a magistrate. First of all, it was a magistrate. And no,
So big difference, right?
Yes.
Yes, there is a big, there's a
So
huge,
that part,
huge
there's a
difference
huge
there.
when the judicial system works
No, but
against
it's
your
just that
position,
you're not-
when the
No,
judicial
but the
system
two-
works
but the
not the
two-
way you want, it's different. We have to say it's different, right?
Well, no, but the two aren't.
I can say I respect both of them. I can say I respect the judge because I kind of agree with what they did here with Mark Kelly. Can you just say that the judicial system probably acted in the way it's supposed to when a judge not appointed by Donald Trump weighed the evidence and gave a warrant
That's
to seize
different.
the documents?
No, that's a different
the issue
situation. But
right here is
Let's
also,
let the judge answer, and then we.
but also, I will tell you that there are different cases that come up, and I don't think that every decision has been a good decision in this situation. I think there have been some U.S. Supreme Court decisions that have not been correct decisions. And so for you to parcel out those two and try to compare them, no, we can't do that.
All right, next for us, a big question facing us right now.
First, the retaliation issue. The Supreme Court has been crystal clear for decades that the government cannot take adverse action against someone for protected speech. That principle shows up in case after case involving public employees, elected officials, and private citizens. Once you cross into punishing someone over speech, especially political speech, courts treat that as a serious First Amendment violation. That's not a democratic standard or a Republican standard. That's constitutional law 101. Second, Joe's attempt to blur the difference between a federal judge and a magistrate judge matters more than he's letting on. Magistrate judges typically handle procedural steps like warrants and preliminary matters. They don't issue sweeping constitutional rulings after full briefing and argument. Comparing a magistrate signing off on a warrant to a federal district judge issuing a substantive constitutional opinion is like comparing a referee starting a game to the Supreme Court writing a final ruling. They serve different roles in the judicial system. And here's another key point. Not all prosecutions are created equal. Tish James campaigned aggressively, sure. Politicians say political things all the time, but courts don't just rubber stamp prosecutions because a politician is fired up. Charges still have to survive motions to dismiss, evidentiary hearings, and appeals. Judges, including Republican-appointed ones, have thrown out cases when they lacked merit. That's the system working. Joe's broader argument is basically, well, Democrats might prosecute Republicans later, so what's the difference? But that logic is dangerous. If we accept that retaliation is inevitable, then we're normalizing it. The whole point of separation of powers is to stop that spiral. Life-tenured judges exist precisely so they can say, no, you don't get to weaponize this. Also worth noting, when courts rule against Trump officials, many of those rulings have come from judges appointed by Republicans, including Trump himself. That undercuts the idea that every adverse ruling is partisan revenge. It suggests that sometimes the law just says what it says.